Alvin Plantinga's modal ontological argument is probably the best argument for the existence of God. It uses the laws of modal logic and acts similar to a mathematical proof.
You know, you can't just logic God into existence. You're gonna need some evidence. But so long as you're making this argument, let's do this. Greetings, fellow space travelers. BionicDance here. Meet YouTuber Inspiring Philosophy. I totally meant to respond to this video like 2 years ago and just somehow never got around to it. So here we go, the ontological argument for God's existence.
To start, here's how the modal ontological argument works. Premise 1. It is possible that God exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. Premise 4. If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. And premise 5. If God exists in the actual world, then God exists.
Sure does seem to me like there's some weapons-grade logical leaps in there. But what the hell, let's give him a chance to explain.
First, you should understand that when philosophers say a possible world, they mean a hypothetical situation. It is generally a way for philosophers to test an idea, to see if it's logical, by asking, could it exist in a possible world like ours?
Raise your hand if you'd already figured that part out.
However, the one thing people seem to misunderstand the most in the argument is how God is defined. Some atheists say we're just imagining God into existence.
Well, aren't you? I mean, if you're going to prove that something external to the mind exists, you're going to have to present hard data. You're going to need more than just a logical argument. And then the dude shows a clip from the atheist experience where they compare God to a unicorn, which, frankly, he misunderstands.
Okay, here's the problem. They are falling into the typical error of misunderstanding how God is defined, and because of their ignorance, they are concluding that the argument doesn't work. So we need to look at how God is actually defined and how it differs from how you would define a unicorn.
But here's the problem with that. You're essentially guilty of begging the question. You're essentially expecting us to accept that your definition of God is the correct one, regardless of the actual nature of such a creature, assuming one exists.
Now, there are 3 ways to define a being or an entity in the ontological argument. An entity can either be impossible, which means it exists in no possible worlds. An example would be a square circle. An entity can be contingent, which means it exists in some possible worlds, like a unicorn. A unicorn could exist in some possible worlds, but not in others. Last, an entity can be necessary, which means it has to exist in all possible worlds. Now, what do we mean when we say something necessarily has to exist in all possible worlds? Well, examples of necessary entities are numbers, absolute truths, and shape definitions.
Notice, if you will, how absolutely none of these are anything at all like a magical being that spun the universe out of nothingness, assigned morality, and which cannot be physically demonstrated the way, say, numbers or shape definitions can. In fact, all of these other things are much, much simpler than such a being. Frankly, trying to compare a god to numbers or shape definitions sounds an awful lot like a category error.
So when we talk of God in this argument, we are saying that if he exists, he would have to be a necessary entity, because God is defined as a maximally great being, and a maximally great being is defined as a being that possesses all qualities that are better to have, which we define as great-making properties.
But see, once again, this is begging the question, because you have defined God as a maximally great being, and assuming God exists, that doesn't mean he is a maximally great being. Your definition could be wrong. Furthermore, trying to claim that God has all of the traits that are better to have, well, better is subjective. Better is a point of view. It's not objective. Furthermore, if God is as omnipotent as people say, he should have all traits, including the evil ones. And, once again, that's assuming God even exists.
Other examples are love, wisdom, and power. A maximally great being would also have to have these properties to their maximal extent. He would also possess no qualities that are bad to have, such as imperfection or corruption.
Like I said, this sounds an awful lot like wishful thinking.
But most of all, he would have to possess the great-making property of necessity, because being necessary is a property that would be better to have.
Would it? Suppose some possible world really, really sucks and this God wants no part of it. Then it wouldn't be such a great-making property, would it?
Now, the idea of God being necessary is consistent with Scripture.
Or, to put it another way, it's consistent with religious fan fiction that has no actual objective evidence to back up the magical bits.
So when skeptics try to debunk this argument by going through the premise with a unicorn in place of God, they are trying to define God in the same way you would define a contingent being. Whereas when we use God in the ontological argument, we are saying God is more than just contingent. He is maximally great, and anything maximally great must be a necessary entity.
And once again, you're guilty of begging the question, but more than that, you're essentially guilty of a straw man argument. Because you see, the argument has nothing to do with the essential nature of God or the unicorn. What it has to do with is the fact that people have claimed a magical being exists for which we have no evidence. That is the comparison. When it comes to questions of existence, of mind-external existence, the question is a scientific one, not a philosophical one. And yet you're trying to use philosophy, you're trying to use pure reason to show that something outside the mind exists.
So does it feel convincing? Well, not really. But when it boils down, it's not a matter of how you feel. What matters is what is logically coherent.
Exactly my point.
The only way for skeptics to debunk this argument is to show that it is impossible for a maximally great being to exist.
Except that it's not the job of the skeptic to disprove anything. A skeptic is not necessarily a naysayer. They're just someone who questions the validity of another person's beliefs, the logic upon which they rest. You are the one putting forward the argument. It's up to you to prove it and to patch any logical holes someone might point out. You have not presented any evidence for the existence of your God. You've just presented a philosophical argument that doesn't hold water when compared to the real world.
The most common way this is tried is with the Omnipotence Paradox. It is most commonly presented like this. Can God create a stone so heavy that even he can't move? If God cannot create the stone, then he is not all-powerful. But if God can create the stone and can't move it, then he is still not all-powerful. Therefore, the idea of God is impossible. However, this attempt is debunked in the question itself as a logical absurdity. Asking can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy even he can't move implies that omnipotence is defined as able to do the logically impossible.
You know, you're right. There is a logical absurdity here. That's precisely what the paradox is pointing out. You don't get to change the definition of omnipotent just because you want it to apply to your God. It does mean all-powerful, infinitely powerful. And if that does not include the ability to perform logical absurdities, then that's not omnipotence. And isn't that what magic really is? Whether we're talking about sorcery, alchemy, witchcraft, or divine magic, and let's face it, that's what miracles really are, godly magic, we are talking about something that breaks the laws of the universe, something that takes nature and says, this is going to happen whether it should or not. When God turned Lot's wife into a pillar of salt, well, the human body has roughly 40 teaspoons of salt in it. That's not so much a pillar as it is a small pile. So how did God make a pillar of salt out of a human being? That sounds to me like something that breaks reality, doesn't it? And don't even get me started on making it rain for 40 days and 40 nights, or raising Jesus from the dead, or heck, spinning the entire universe into existence out of nothing. Now, it's not my fault that you chowderheads decided to define God as being omnipotent, or that your holy text described things that are clearly logical absurdities, but you don't get to move the goalpost now because it serves your purposes.
The Bible has verses that state it's impossible for God to do certain things. Asking the question is like asking, can an omnipotent being create a square with 3 sides?
I'm sorry, are you actually trying to say that being able to lie is a logical absurdity? That God being unable to lie is just like being unable to create a square with 3 sides? Who's putting forward the logical absurdities now?
Now you might be asking, well, why can't God do the logically impossible? He is all-powerful, so he should be able to do anything. Well, you need to understand that logic derives from order. Without order, nothing makes sense, including existence. So you cannot use logical absurdities to disprove the existence of God.
Where is it written that everything has to make sense, that everything has to be logical? I mean, I can understand the comfort in that, but why does it have to be so? Furthermore, nobody is using logical absurdities to disprove the existence of God. At most, they're being used to show that the ontological argument doesn't work. There are other ways you could use to prove that a God exists that are a lot more convincing than this steaming pant load. What it comes down to is this. There are three possibilities. First, God does not exist, in which case this entire argument just falls apart. Second, God does exist, and as you've described him, which means he's not all-powerful, and thus not a necessary being, nor is he as he's described in the Bible. Or third, God does exist, and as described in the Bible, which means that your definition of omnipotent is wrong, and this makes God vulnerable to the Omnipotence Paradox. If it's either of those last two, you're guilty of moving the goalposts and begging the question. But no matter which it is, the ontological argument simply does not hold up against even the slightest scrutiny. If you look at it, I hope you start to see the ontological argument the way I do, like religion's cheat code for God's existence. Until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please, think.